There are moments when time stops. When the universe holds its breath. When everything that came before leads to a single point, and everything that follows will be forever changed. For James Brown, that moment arrived not under the spotlight, not in front of thousands, not during any of the legendary performances that made him an icon. It arrived in the shadows. In a forgotten hallway. Where the music was muffled and the glamour faded. Where he discovered something happening, something so wrong, so cruel, so unnecessary, that it would crack open the armor he'd built around himself since childhood. The man who had screamed his pain into microphones, who had transformed abandonment into art, was about to meet someone who reminded him of everything he'd tried to forget. And in that collision of past and present, of power and powerlessness, James Brown would make a decision that revealed the soul behind The Godfather. Before we continue with this untold story, if you appreciate deep dives into the hidden moments that shaped music history, please subscribe and turn on notifications. These are the stories that never made the headlines but changed everything. April 1968. The Apollo Theater basement. That's when he heard the voices. Not performance voices, not the careful professional tones people used when they knew James Brown might be listening. These were casual, careless, cruel. The kind of voices people used when they thought nobody important was around. James slowed his pace, something tightening in his chest, a warning signal his body had learned to recognize after years of navigating rooms where respect was conditional and violence simmered just beneath the surface. "Get out of here, you don't belong backstage." The voice belonged to someone James didn't immediately recognize, probably one of the venue's security crew or a stagehand from the support act. "You're gonna mess something up, wandering around like that. I think she's lost or something." A second voice, younger, with a laugh that held no humor. "Hey, can you even understand what we're saying?" James rounded the corner and the scene assembled itself in pieces. 3 men, their backs to him, forming a loose semicircle. And at the center, pressed against the wall like she wanted to disappear into it, a little girl. 8 years old, maybe 9. She wore a yellow dress that looked carefully chosen, lovingly pressed, the kind of outfit a parent picks for a special occasion. Her dark hair was pulled back with a ribbon that matched the dress. But it was her face that stopped James cold. The unmistakable features of Down syndrome. And more than that, the expression of someone who'd learned to make herself small, to take up as little space as possible, to somehow apologize for existing. The girl wasn't crying. That detail would stay with James for the rest of his life. She wasn't crying. Her eyes were wide and dry, her hands clutched together in front of her chest, and she was doing that thing children do when they're trying so hard to be good, to be invisible, to not make things worse. The kind of silence that comes from knowing that tears might make the bad thing worse. "What's going on here?" James's voice cut through the hallway with the same authority that commanded stages. The 3 men spun around, their faces cycling through surprise, recognition, and then the careful neutrality of people who'd just been caught doing something they knew was wrong. "Mr. Brown, we were just..." The oldest of the 3, a heavy-set man with a clipboard, started to construct an explanation. "This girl was wandering around backstage, and we were trying to figure out where she came from." "By cornering her?" James stepped closer, and the men instinctively moved apart, creating space. "By making her feel like she did something wrong?" "We didn't mean anything by it," the younger one said, defensive now. "We were just doing our job, keeping unauthorized people out of the backstage area." James looked at the girl. She still hadn't moved, still pressed against that wall, but her eyes had shifted to him. He saw recognition there, but also confusion, the same look he'd seen on 1,000 faces that couldn't quite reconcile the man with the legend. Up close, he could see she was trembling slightly, not from cold but from the kind of fear that lives in your muscles, that makes your whole body feel like it might shake apart. "What's your name?" James crouched down, bringing himself to the girl's eye level, making himself smaller, less threatening. The girl didn't answer. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. She looked at the men behind James, then back to him, as if trying to calculate whether this was a trap, whether answering would make things better or worse. "It's okay," James said, his voice softer now, the voice he used in quiet moments, not the voice that screamed into microphones. "Nobody here is going to hurt you. I promise." "Sarah." The word came out small, almost a whisper. The girl's voice had a thickness to it, the speech pattern common with Down syndrome, but clear enough. My name is Sarah. Sarah, James repeated, letting the name settle. That's a beautiful name. I'm James. Can you tell me how you got down here, Sarah? The story came out in fragments, halting and uncertain. Sarah had come with her mother to see the show. They had tickets, real tickets that her mother had saved for months to afford. Sarah loved music, loved dancing, loved James Brown. Her mother had played his records until they wore thin, had taught Sarah the basic steps, the shuffles and spins that made up the vocabulary of soul. But the crowd upstairs had been so big, so loud, and Sarah had gotten scared. She'd seen a door, thought maybe she could find somewhere quieter, just for a minute, just to catch her breath. And then she'd gotten lost in the hallways, couldn't find her way back, and then these men had found her and started asking questions in voices that got louder and sharper when she couldn't answer fast enough. James looked down at Sarah, at this small girl in her yellow dress, and felt the weight of a decision forming. He could take her upstairs, help her find her mother, get her back to her seat. That would be the safe choice, the professional choice, the choice that got him back to his dressing room with enough time to finish preparing for the show. Or he could do something else. Something that had nothing to do with professionalism and everything to do with the 4-year-old boy who still lived inside him, still remembered what it felt like to be abandoned, to be told through silence and absence that you weren't worth staying for. Sarah, he said, the decision made before he'd fully articulated it to himself, how would you like to watch the show from somewhere special? Her eyes widened. From my seat? Better than your seat. James smiled, a real smile, not the performer's smile but something genuine. How would you like to watch from the side of the stage? Right there in the wings, where you can see everything. Sarah's face transformed. The fear drained out of it, replaced by something that looked like disbelief, like joy too big to fully express. Really? Really? And maybe, if you want, you could come out on stage for a minute. Would you like that? The nod was vigorous, her whole body engaged in the affirmation. And then, for the first time since James had found her, Sarah smiled. It was the kind of smile that rearranged everything, that made the hallway feel less like a basement and more like a place where something important was happening. James nodded, then extended his hand to Sarah. She took it, her small fingers wrapping around his, and they walked together through the maze of hallways, back toward the light and sound of the stage. During I Got You, I Feel Good, James made his way to the wings during the instrumental break, the band holding the groove, understanding that whatever was happening was more important than the setlist. He extended his hand to Sarah, and the little girl in the yellow dress walked onto the Apollo Theater stage, into the spotlight, into the roar of 10,000 people who didn't know her story but understood that something special was happening. James didn't make a speech. He didn't explain. He just took Sarah's hand and spun her, gentle and careful, and she laughed, a sound of pure delight that the microphones caught and amplified, and the audience responded with applause that built and built until it became a wall of sound, a wave of human warmth that washed over the stage. They danced together for maybe 30 seconds, James matching his movements to hers, following her lead rather than imposing his own, and in that half-minute something happened that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with humanity. The Godfather of Soul became just a man dancing with a child, giving her a moment of joy so pure it seemed to erase everything that had come before. When James brought Sarah back to the wings, the audience was still applauding. Sarah's mother was sobbing openly now, her hands covering her mouth, and Sarah was glowing, transformed by the experience of being seen, of being celebrated, of mattering. What James didn't know that night, what wouldn't be revealed until years later through interviews with Sarah's family, was the full weight of what that moment meant. Sarah's mother, a woman named Dorothy who worked 2 jobs to support her daughter alone, had been told repeatedly by doctors, by teachers, by well-meaning relatives, that she should institutionalize Sarah. This was 1968, when children with Down syndrome were routinely hidden away, locked in facilities where they'd spend their entire lives, invisible to society, erased from the narrative of what it meant to be human and valuable. Dorothy had refused. She'd insisted that Sarah deserved a life, deserved joy, deserved to experience the world. But the weight of swimming against that tide, of fighting every day for her daughter's right to exist in public spaces, had worn her down to something fragile and desperate. The Apollo tickets had been an act of defiance, a declaration that her daughter deserved beauty and music and celebration. When Sarah had disappeared into the crowd, Dorothy's terror wasn't just about losing her child physically. It was about all her fears being confirmed, about her daughter being hurt or mocked or worse, about the world proving that she'd been wrong to believe Sarah could have a normal life. And then James Brown, the biggest star in Black America, the man who'd become a legend, had taken Sarah's hand and danced with her on the Apollo stage, had treated her not as a problem or a charity case but as a person worthy of that spotlight, worthy of that moment. Years later, Sarah would tell interviewers that her entire life changed that night. Not because of the fame or the story, but because she'd internalized something fundamental about her own worth. She'd felt the audience's love, had experienced what it meant to be celebrated rather than tolerated, and that feeling had become a core memory, a touchstone she'd return to whenever the world tried to make her feel small. But there was another side to this story, one that James never spoke about publicly, one that his closest friends only learned about in fragments over the years. That night at the Apollo, when James crouched down in that hallway and saw Sarah pressed against the wall, something broke inside him. Not broke like shattered, but broke like opened, like a dam giving way to a flood of memories and pain he'd been holding back for decades. The armor he'd built since childhood, the hard shell of performance and persona and relentless forward motion, had a crack in it now. And through that crack poured all the vulnerability he'd been running from. The 4-year-old abandoned by his mother. The teenager brutalized by poverty and racism. The young man desperate to be seen as human. All of it came flooding back in that moment of recognition, of seeing his own pain reflected in a child's face. Songs like Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, recorded just months after the Sarah incident, carried a weight that went beyond politics or protest. They carried the weight of someone who'd remembered what it felt like to be powerless and was determined to transform that memory into something redemptive. But underneath that story, threaded through it like a bass line, is another narrative. It's the story of a man who never forgot what it felt like to be small and powerless, who carried the weight of abandonment and poverty like a physical thing, who built an empire partially as armor against ever feeling that vulnerable again. And it's the story of moments when that armor cracked, when the human being underneath the legend showed through, when James Brown the icon became simply James, a man trying to do the right thing in a hallway where nobody important was watching. But James remembered. He carried that hallway with him, carried Sarah's face pressed against the wall, carried the sound of men's voices making a child feel like her existence was an inconvenience. He carried it through the rest of his career, through the highs and the crashes, through the Grammy wins and the prison sentences, through everything that came after. And in the quiet moments, the spaces between performances when the armor came off and he was just a man sitting alone with his thoughts, James would think about that night and wonder if that 30 seconds of dancing on the Apollo stage was the most important thing he ever did. December 25, 2006. James Brown died on Christmas morning in Atlanta, his heart finally giving out after years of relentless use, after decades of pushing his body beyond what any body should be asked to endure. The world mourned. The tributes poured in. The music played on every station, every channel, a reminder of what had been lost. Sarah, by then a woman of 46, watched the news coverage and cried. Not the public tears of a fan mourning an icon, but the private tears of someone grieving a person who'd fundamentally altered the trajectory of her life. She thought about the yellow dress, long gone now, but preserved in her memory with perfect clarity. She thought about the feeling of James Brown's hand in hers, gentle and careful, treating her like she was made of something precious. She thought about the sound of 10,000 people applauding, not for the legend but for her, for that moment of simple human connection. But after the service, in the quiet moments of reception, Sarah told her story to anyone who'd listen. She told them about a hallway beneath the Apollo Theater, about 3 men who'd made her feel small, about a performer who'd treated her like she mattered. She told them about 30 seconds of dancing that had taught her she deserved to take up space in the world. And the people who listened understood that they were hearing something that wouldn't make it into the official histories, something smaller and more intimate and perhaps more true than the legend. But it echoed. Sarah told it to her students when she became a teacher's aide, working with children with special needs. She told it to parents who were struggling with the same decisions her mother had faced, who were being told to hide their children away. She told it as testimony to the power of being seen, of being treated as fully human, of having your worth acknowledged in a moment when the world wanted you to disappear. James Brown spent his life trying to be seen, to be so big and so loud that nobody could ignore him or dismiss him or make him feel small ever again. He succeeded. He became one of the most important figures in American music, an innovator whose influence cannot be overstated. But in a basement hallway in 1968, he did something that had nothing to do with being seen and everything to do with seeing. He saw a child who the world wanted to ignore. He saw his own pain reflected in her face. And he made a choice that cost him nothing and meant everything. That's the part of the James Brown story that doesn't get told enough. Not because it isn't dramatic or important, but because it's quieter than the legend, more intimate than the icon. It's the story of a man who carried his wounds with him his entire life, who built armor to protect himself from ever feeling powerless again, and who let that armor crack open when he saw someone else who needed protecting. And Sarah carried that message with her for the rest of her life, a gift from a man who understood what it meant to be small and powerless, who remembered what it felt like when someone chose to see you as human. That's the real legacy, the one that doesn't chart or stream or win awards. It's the legacy of moments in forgotten hallways, of choices made when nobody important is watching, of the human soul revealed in the shadows between spotlights. Hashtag the Untold Chapter, 1000 Kilim. Hashtag the letter that never arrived. 3 weeks before James Brown died, a package arrived at his Atlanta home. Inside was a videotape dated April 5, 1968, and a letter written in careful, deliberate handwriting, the kind that comes from someone who learned to form words with precision, with intention. The letter was from Sarah. James never opened it. His health was failing, his body finally giving out after decades of pushing past every limit. The package sat in a pile of mail, surrounded by legal documents and fan letters. It would be discovered months later during estate sorting, but by then the conversation that might have been would remain forever unspoken. But the letter existed. And in it, Sarah had written something that would have broken James's heart and healed it simultaneously. Hashtag the moment everything changed. Sarah described how James had crouched down in that Apollo hallway with a precision suggesting she'd replayed it thousands of times. She wrote about his eyes looking directly into hers, not with pity or discomfort, but like she was real, like she mattered. He'd looked at her like her fear and trembling and difference were all just parts of being human rather than reasons to be dismissed. She wrote about the 30 seconds on stage in language that was simple but devastated with meaning. How the spotlight had felt warm. How the applause had sounded like thunder, like love made audible. How James had followed her movements rather than leading, letting her be herself. How in that half-minute, she'd understood something fundamental about her own worth. But then Sarah's letter revealed the true depth of what that night had meant. She wrote about Monday morning, going to school and being different, not because of Down syndrome, but because she'd danced with James Brown at the Apollo Theater. Different because she had a story that made classmates lean in and listen. She wrote about Michael, a boy who'd never spoken to her before, who treated her like she was invisible. On Monday, Michael asked what it was like to be on stage. Then he asked if she liked music. Then he asked if maybe she wanted to sit together at lunch. Such a small thing. But Sarah wrote about it like it was a miracle, because in her world, it was. Hashtag the ripple nobody saw. The videotape contained footage that would have shattered James. Dorothy had filmed it over 38 years, a visual chronicle of everything that came from that single moment. The tape showed Sarah at 9, giving a presentation about James Brown to an actually listening class. At 13, performing in a talent show. At 16, working her first job, the manager hired her because he'd read about her Apollo moment, realized that if James Brown thought she was worth celebrating, maybe he should give her a chance. It showed Sarah at 23, speaking at a conference for parents of children with Down syndrome, telling her story to people who were terrified and exhausted. It showed hope replacing resignation in their faces. It showed Sarah at 30, training to become a teacher's aide, wanting to help children feel the way James had made her feel. At 37, working with a boy who wouldn't speak, who seemed unreachable. The tape captured the moments Sarah told him about a hallway beneath the Apollo, about being scared, about a man who'd chosen to see her. The boy looked up, made eye contact for the first time in months, and whispered, "Really?" Hashtag the mathematics of kindness. Dorothy had been keeping count. In the letter, in Dorothy's handwriting now, was a list that read like accounting but felt like testimony. 43 children with Down syndrome whose parents decided not to institutionalize them after hearing Sarah's story. 16 teachers who'd changed their approach to special education. 8 schools that implemented inclusion programs. 127 families who'd written to say Sarah's story had changed their children's lives. And beneath that, in Sarah's handwriting again, "You saved me in that hallway, but you saved all of them too, and you never even knew." ## the secret James kept. Sarah had understood more than anyone realized. She wrote about seeing James's funeral on television, watching the tributes celebrating his music and influence. Then she wrote about something nobody else had mentioned, something only she noticed because she'd spent 38 years thinking about that moment. She wrote about how James's hands had been shaking when he'd taken hers in that hallway. How his voice had held something that sounded like fear beneath the gentleness. How when he'd crouched down, she'd seen old pain in his eyes that looked like her own. Sarah had realized, even at 8 years old, that James hadn't just been helping her. He'd been saving himself. Reaching back to the 4-year-old boy watching his mother leave, the child who'd learned to make himself invisible. He'd been trying to give her what nobody had given him, the message that she deserved to be seen. "I think you saw yourself in me," Sarah wrote. "I think that's why you were crying in the hallway after. I saw you wipe your eyes before you went back to your dressing room. I never told anyone because it felt private. But I want you to know that I understood. You were saving both of us that night. And it worked." ## the gift that remained unopened. The package sat in James's house for 3 months after his death, buried in paperwork, overlooked in the chaos of estate settlement. When it was finally discovered and opened, the people who read the letter and watched the tape understood they were holding something sacred. Sarah was contacted, invited to be part of a documentary about James's life. She declined. She'd written the letter for James, not for history. She'd wanted him to know what that moment had meant. The fact that he'd never read it was painful, but Sarah understood missed connections, messages that arrived too late. But she asked for one thing, that the letter be buried with James, placed in his coffin before it was sealed. Someone in James's organization remembered Sarah's story, remembered the night at the Apollo, and made it happen. So James Brown was buried with Sarah's letter resting on his chest, unread but present, a testimony to impact he'd never fully understood, to lives he'd changed without knowing, to the legacy that existed beyond the music and the carefully documented achievements. 30 seconds of dancing. That's all it had been, measured in time. But if you were tracking impact, if you were measuring the ways a single choice could ripple outward through time, those 30 seconds were infinite.